For more on the day's top political stories, let's bring in Nikole Killion and Ed O'Keefe. Nikole is a CBS News congressional correspondent. Ed is CBS News senior White House and political correspondent. Ed, let's start with you. What can you tell us about President Biden's call with European leaders this morning about Ukraine?
Yeah, this time it was a call with the leaders of the UK, France, Italy, and Germany. They are holding at least one of these a week now as they keep each other abreast of their ongoing conversations on this subject and making sure that they're all essentially singing from the same song sheet. In this case, the White House says that the president's comments over the weekend in Poland that suggested what the White House says was his personal opinion that Vladimir Putin should be removed from power didn't come up on the call. The president also said that they discussed the ongoing apparent negotiations now between Ukraine and Russia, but said that it's too soon to tell whether the Russians are being serious about this or whether they are indeed trying to make something happen. And that's sort of the skepticism that he has publicly expressed about this whole situation and the possibility of talks ever since they began a few weeks ago. But again, signaling that the Europeans and the U.S. are clearly aware of them, monitoring them, hopeful, but deeply skeptical so far.
Nikole, let me turn to you. The House Armed Services Committee received a classified briefing today about the status of talks for a new Iran nuclear deal. What do we know about it, and when might we actually see an actual proposal?
Well, I think it's still unclear. A source familiar with this briefing earlier today with the House Armed Services Committee confirmed that it didn't happen, but couldn't share much more beyond that in terms of details, what emerged, and whether or not there are any updates with respect to negotiations and potential proposal. In fact, over here on the Senate side, Leader Chuck Schumer was also asked if he has seen any new proposals to date, but he also declined comment. What we do know is that this is an ongoing process. Earlier this week, Secretary of State Blinken said deal or no deal, the U.S.'s goal is to deter Iran's nuclear capability, and that the U.S. would kind of work towards that end regardless of whether or not they get an agreement. And worth noting that certainly he has in the past noted some progress on this front, telling our Margaret Brennan earlier this month that he thinks that we are potentially close to some type of agreement, but stressing that there were a number of challenging issues that remain.
Let's talk about an international economic issue. We've been following this America Competes Act. It passed in the Senate last night pretty overwhelmingly, and it focuses on this supply chain crisis with semiconductors and China. What does it do in practice, and where do things head next, Nikole?
Well, so at this point, it heads to what's known as a conference process. Basically, when a piece of legislation passes the House and the Senate, then the two sides meet and essentially try to reconcile the bill. So that is really the next steps for this piece of legislation, but it does invest heavily, upwards of $50 billion for additional manufacturing and research of these semiconductors and these microchips that are really essential in terms of, being in so many different products that we use every day, whether it's your automobile, whether it's your smartphone. And because of a shortage of these types of chips, it has led to supply chain issues. And so that is the hope among lawmakers, that it can kind of rectify some of these supply chain issues we've seen in the past by increasing production of these chips.
And the CEO of Intel was here last week testifying in support. We just saw an image of him putting his muscle behind getting this bill through. Ed, let's talk about Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell. He's saying Republicans want any new COVID spending to come from existing funds. What does that mean for the White House's priority of getting this new money to fight this new wave?
Means it's going to take a while. I think that's the bottom line. Look, there's been this disagreement since essentially the beginning of the year when the administration said we're going to need a little more money here to keep this going, because while case numbers may have gone down, while mandates may have been removed across the country, the pandemic is not over. And there is still money to be spent. There is still a need to stockpile vaccine, for example. There's a disagreement between Republicans and Democrats over where exactly money to pay for all that should come from. Is there still money left in the big trillion-dollar pieces of legislation passed in the first year of the Biden administration, even some of the legislation passed in the last year of the Trump administration, that cities and states haven't yet spent or that the federal government hasn't allocated? And if there is, that's the money to pull from, Republicans say. Democrats say not so fast. That money's going to get used, or it has been used, and Republicans are trying to play games with the money, and we still need it. And there was conversation about that again today. As you heard, the FDA is announcing that more people can get COVID vaccine boosters. Right now, the Biden administration says there are plenty to do that. for anyone who's now eligible, and there will continue to be for the next few weeks or months. But if we go into the fall, long term, supply is going to dwindle, and the ability to say that the United States has a shot for everybody who's eligible for one should they want to get it will no longer exist. So this is one of those things that's going to drag out until there's an emergency. You two know better than I do these days that Congress is a deadline-driven organization, and even then deadlines go that way and they're still working on it. And that's likely to be the case in this instance. And it probably will take, frankly, as unfortunate as it is, a big uptick again in cases to really get lawmakers in the White House to talk about this. But the White House has made clear, at least since February, they want this money, they need it, because they understand the pandemic isn't over yet.
There's going to have to be a bridge built here. The top Republican appropriator in the Senate, Richard Shelby, tells me he doesn't see the urgency and why there is urgency. So they're going to have to figure that out between the White House and the Republicans in the Senate. Nikole, let's talk about the judge. Ketanji Brown Jackson meeting again today with Republicans, most notably perhaps Senator Mitt Romney late today. What are you hearing? What's the latest on possible Republican votes for Judge Jackson?
Well, speaking of deadlines, Leader Schumer has made clear that he believes that Judge Jackson will be confirmed by the end of their work period, which is right before the Easter holiday. And in advance of this potential vote, of course, this really is like the last week for Judge Jackson to really meet with senators, make her case to those that haven't already had an opportunity to meet with her. And so this is the first time that she has met with Republican senators today since her confirmation hearings last week. So she met with Senator Romney, she met with Senator Tuberville, she met with Senator Haggerty earlier today, and right after this meeting with Senator Romney, she also met with Senator Susan Collins for a second time, which is notable because so far that is the only senator that she has met with for a second time, and primarily that was because Senator Collins said that she had some additional questions following the hearing. And what's notable is that Senator Collins is someone who did support Judge Jackson's confirmation in the past for the circuit court. She has also backed the majority of Supreme Court nominees when they have come through this Congress, with the exception of Amy Coney Barrett. So she could be a crucial potential yes vote. Certainly that's what the White House would like to see. But again, she has not made her position clear yet, nor has Senator Romney. He would not tip his hand in this meeting or after this meeting that he had with Judge Jackson earlier today, simply saying that it was a wide-ranging conversation. Also worth noting that the White House did seem to feel relatively good coming out of that Collins meeting, saying that they felt that they had answered the senator's questions and that they believe it was a good meeting. Of course, many more meetings in Judge Jackson's future throughout the course of this week.
Yet a potential vote is fast approaching. Got to get the meetings done quickly. Ed, the president released this $5.8 trillion federal budget for the year, and he did it during a particularly busy news week when a lot of other things are going on. So I'm wondering what the talk around the White House today has been about his proposal or any reaction to his proposal.
Well, they certainly believe that it's something that Congress should look at seriously, but I think even they understand it's merely a statement of political priorities, not necessarily the final budget or spending plan. The two things that stick out, I think, most politically right now, number one, the idea that much of the president's budget plan would be paid for by what they're calling a billionaire's tax, essentially on the 700 wealthiest Americans. And they aren't all billionaires. It's people essentially with a real estate value or a household value of at least $100 million on paper. How that's calculated exactly isn't clear, but that's how they'd pay for it. That is something that is backed by Democrats overall, including moderate Joe Manchin of West Virginia, who, of course, is a critical vote when it comes to spending legislation and has made clear since last summer that with inflation now a big problem, government spending has to come down. So it would be paid for that way. This budget, they say, also is big on deficit reduction. And the other more interesting political element in here, among many others, but one that's going to get some attention as the year continues, is the idea that this budget would increase funding to federal, state, local police agencies across the country, designed to completely refute the idea that Democrats are, quote, soft on crime or want to defund the police. Remember, that was a big issue in the 2020 elections, especially down ballot. The president, as he said in the State of the Union, wants to see an increase in funding, not only to local police, but even to things like the Immigration and Customs Enforcement Agency and the others that are doing border security work. That's coming, of course, ahead of an anticipated rise in immigration, as we always see as the months get warmer. And of course, going into a summer ahead of an election year, they can anticipate that immigration will be a big issue of concern. So there on public safety, on immigration, increased funding for the Pentagon, this White House believes that the arguments about public safety and national security are refuted because they're suggesting big increases in funding.
Yep. Budgets are a statement of value and message in a midterm election year when you're trying to win on message. At the White House, Ed O'Keefe; at the Senate, Nikole Killion. Thank you both.